You've been told to be more empathetic, more vulnerable, more available to your people, and perhaps you've genuinely tried. You've listened more carefully, you've made yourself available, you've carried people's concerns, frustrations, and anxieties. But here's the question nobody seems to ask. Who's carrying you? Because the modern leadership conversation has become heavily focused on what leaders need to give, while paying very little attention to what leaders need in order to remain effective themselves. And that's creating a problem, a serious one. The leadership world has spent years encouraging leaders to become more emotionally available, and I think that's important. But there is a gap in that conversation that's quietly costing leaders their clarity, their well-being, and sometimes their careers. The reality is that senior leaders are often carrying the emotional weight of entire teams, departments, and organizations. They absorb uncertainty, they absorb conflict, they absorb pressure, and then they're expected to remain calm, decisive, and resilient throughout. The problem isn't empathy. The problem is empathy without self-awareness, because when you continually absorb pressure without understanding what it's doing to your own internal state, that pressure doesn't suddenly disappear. It accumulates, and eventually it begins influencing your leadership in ways you may not even recognize. You become a little more reactive, a little more impatient, a little more controlling, and a little more disconnected. Not because you've become a bad leader, but because you've become a depleted one. And this is where I think most leadership development misses something fundamental. What we often call leadership problems are rarely leadership problems at all. They're self-leadership problems. Let me explain. When leaders are under sustained pressure, that pressure tends to show up in three predictable ways. The first is reactive decision-making. Instead of responding thoughtfully, you react instinctively. You make decisions faster than you would normally. You become more defensive. You default towards certainty rather than curiosity. Not because you're incapable of good judgment, but because stress narrows perspective. When our nervous system is overloaded, we lose access to some of our best thinking. The second pattern is micromanagement. This one is particularly interesting because most people assume micromanagement is about control. In my experience, it's usually about anxiety. When leaders don't feel internally stable, they often try to create stability externally. They check more, monitor more, intervene more. The team experiences a lack of trust. The leader experiences a need for certainty. Neither side sees what's really happening underneath. The issue isn't control, it's internal unease. The third pattern is emotional withdrawal, and this may be the most damaging of all. The leader doesn't become aggressive, they become absent. They stop asking questions. They become quieter, more distant, more transactional. The team notices immediately. Psychological safety drops, candor disappears, and performance begins to suffer. What's important to understand here is that none of these patterns are character flaws. They're symptoms, they're outputs, they're signs that something deeper needs attention. Which brings me to the central idea behind everything I teach. Leadership starts on the inside. Your thoughts create your feelings drive your behavior, and your behavior creates your results. Yet most leadership development focuses almost entirely on behavior. New communication models, new management techniques, new frameworks, new tools, and those things can help, but if the internal state generating the behavior remains unchanged, the results rarely last. You're trying to change the fruit without addressing the roots. This is why self-awareness matters so much, not as a soft skill or a nice to have, but as a leadership capability. Because when you understand what's happening inside you, you get choice. And leadership lives in that choice. I remember working with a senior leader who was doing almost everything right on paper. A strong performer, highly respected and deeply committed to her team. Yet she felt exhausted, reactive and increasingly overwhelmed. When we explored what was happening, we discovered she'd spent years operating on responsibility, obligation, and adrenaline. She knew exactly what everyone else needed, but she'd lost sight of what she needed. The breakthrough wasn't a new strategy, it wasn't a better framework, it was learning to notice her own internal state before it started driving her behavior. And that's what I mean when I talk about leading from the inside out, building an internal center of gravity, a steadiness that doesn't depend entirely on circumstances going your way. Because leadership becomes much easier when your inner world isn't constantly at war with itself. So what does that look like in practice? Let me give you 3 simple habits, not life-changing rituals, not complicated systems, just small practices that create awareness. The first is a 2-second pause. Before responding in a difficult conversation, before replying to that email or making a decision, just pause. 2 seconds. That tiny gap creates a space between the stimulus and response, and in that space you move from reaction to response, to choice. The second habit is learning your stress signals. Your body knows you're stressed long before your conscious mind catches up. For some people, it's tension in the shoulders. For others, it's shallow breathing, a tight chest, a racing mind, impatience. Learn your signals because awareness is always the first step toward regulation. The third habit is a brief end-of-day audit. Just a couple of minutes asking yourself 3 questions. What am I carrying? What have I been ignoring? And what do I need? That's it. No elaborate journaling process, no complicated reflection framework, or even meditation. Just honest self-awareness. And because most leaders spend all day checking on everyone else's condition while never checking on their own, and eventually that becomes expensive. So before we finish, I want to challenge one final idea. Many organizations still confuse resilience with toughness. They believe resilient leaders are the ones who absorb pressure without showing it, the ones who appear unaffected, unshakable, invulnerable. I don't think that's resilience. I think that's suppression. Real resilience isn't about never being knocked off balance. It's about how quickly you find your way back. Think about the most steady leaders you've ever met, the people you trusted during difficult moments, the people whose presence calmed a room. I suspect they weren't immune to pressure. They weren't unaffected by uncertainty. They simply knew how to process it, how to regulate it, and how to return to clarity when things become difficult. That's resilience, not toughness. It's the ability to come back to center again and again because your team doesn't need you to be invulnerable. They need you to be grounded. And grounding comes from self-leadership. So let me leave you with this. Traditional leadership advice tells you to give more empathy, more support, more presence. And those things matter, but they're only sustainable when they're built on a strong internal foundation, because you can't continuously support others while neglecting yourself. Human capable leadership starts from the inside. It starts with understanding that your inner world shapes your outer results. And when you learn to lead yourself more effectively, every aspect of your leadership improves as a result. If this resonated with you, let me know in the comments, and tell me this: which of the 3 practices are you going to try first? The 2-second pause, learning your stress signals, or the end-of-day audit? I'd genuinely love to know. And if you're interested in exploring the inner side of leadership more deeply, make sure you're subscribed, because that's exactly what we'll be talking about here. And if you'd like to do my scorecard, the link is in the description and the comments. See you in the next video.